Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fourth stage of a series that takes us to Sweden, and where in fact we look at how Sweden was Christianized. The Christianization of Sweden began more than 1,000 years ago, and if you have followed the first three stages, you may have realized that the places we're looking at are at a relatively short distance from the capital of Sweden, Stockholm. I say relatively, of course, compared to the big size of the country. But today, we are going to go much further south, at more than 500 kilometers from the capital, to a small village of the province of Skåne called Torna Hällestad. Skåne is the southernmost province of Sweden, surrounded by the sea in the south and also on the west and east. And Torna Hällestad is at 30 kilometers east from the main city of Skåne, Malmö, and also from the historic capital, 15 kilometers from the historic capital of Skåne, which is Lund. Now, this is a small village which is surrounded by fields and woods, and at the heart of the village we find a church which is very typical for this area of Sweden and also for Denmark. I'm talking about a Romanesque church with white walls and red tiled roof. If you enter within the church, we find there, on the ceiling, paintings which depict scenes of the Bible. These paintings date back to the 15th century, that's the century preceding the Reformation, and even though they would be worth exploring, this is not the main reason why we go within the church. Because the reason we go into this church is for elements that date back to more than 1,000 years ago. They are much older than the paintings, and in fact even older than the church itself. I'm talking about rune stones that are embedded within the walls of the church. Now, if you are not from the Nordic nations, you may wonder what rune stones are. Well, these were stones on which we could find engraved runic alphabet, so text in runic alphabet. And the runic alphabet was in fact in use by the Vikings before the arrival of Christianity. These stones were often meant to be for deceased people, a memorial for deceased people. And this is in fact what we find here in Torna Hällestad, stones for the deceased people, for some deceased people. And in particular, on one stone, we find a text which says, of course, in English, a translation in English says, and I'm going to read it, Askel placed this stone in memory of Toki Gormer's son, to him a faithful lord. He did not flee at Uppsala. Valiant men placed in memory of their brother the stone on the hill, steadied by runes. They went closest to Gormer's Toki. This sounds like a rather enigmatic message, but what does it say? It talks about Uppsala, about a battle that happened in Uppsala. Now, Uppsala is more than 600 kilometers north from Torna Hällestad. That's rather far from this place. So why would that man go that far? And in fact, the reason is that we are talking about one of the most famous battles of the history of Sweden that happened on Swedish ground. And I'm talking about the Battle of Fyrisvellir. Now, the Fyris is a river that goes through the city of Uppsala, and the battle was waged then on the plains surrounding the river. It was waged between two lords, two of the main lords of the country. One of them was called Erik, who was nicknamed Segersäll in Swedish, that means the victorious. And he was waging the battle against his nephew called Styrbjörn, the strong, Starker in Swedish. Now, Erik the Victorious was the grandson of a very important king for the history of Sweden, that was Erik Edmundsson. Now, he is important because he was the king who united the two main tribes of Sweden, the Sveas and the Goths. Now, you might have guessed already, the winner of the battle was Erik the Victorious, and in fact, the nickname probably comes from that battle. But not only, also Erik was a victorious warrior already before the Battle of Fyrisvellir. He had subdued Finland and also Livonia, that is Estonia and Latvia today, to his rule. So the Battle of Fyrisberg was very significant because Eric gained the throne over and against his nephew. But what is particular is that battle, these two lords had waged the battle in the name of a specific Norse god, two specific Norse gods, in fact. Eric the Victorious waged the battle in the name of the famous god Odin, while Styrbjörn waged it in the name of Thor. So, from a pagan perspective, it does seem that Odin won the battle against Thor. That's from a pagan perspective. But, in fact, we are exploring the Christianization of Sweden. So what does that have to do with the Christianization of Sweden? In fact, what is important to realize is that this battle, the Battle of Fyrisberg, is in fact one of the last, if not the last, battle waged between two resolutely pagan kings. After that, things will begin to change. But we're talking about a battle that happened 600 kilometers north from Torna Hällestad. So why are we here in Skåne and not there in Uppsala talking about the Christianization of Sweden? Well, this is because of what happens after the battle. Eric was a warrior, not a Christian at all. He went down now, crossed the sea to wage now battle in Denmark and try to subdue Denmark to his kingdom. But what is important is what happened there according to the Chronicles of Adam of Bremen, one of the main sources of the history of Sweden at the time. In fact, Eric the Victorious is said to have adopted Christianity while he was probably while he was there in Denmark. Now, this is significant because it would be the first time that a Swedish king, in fact, adopts the Christian faith. This had already happened before in Denmark, but not in Sweden. Now, the king of Sweden, Eric, adopts the Christian faith. Where, in fact, his adoption of the Christian faith didn't seem to be very profound, might have been rather superficial, because very soon he would relapse into paganism, and history tells that he died as a pagan only 10 years after the Battle of Fyrisberg, which happened in 983. He died in 993. So this does not tell yet why this is important for the Christianization of Sweden. Of course, the fact that a king adopts the Christian faith in itself, that's worth mentioning. But there's something more to that. Now, the Christian faith in Sweden had begun to take root already 200 years earlier, or less than 200 years, before that king adopted Christianity. We had explored that in previous stages. The main places where Christianity had already taken root in Sweden were Birka and Visby, and we had seen that these places were trading towns. So they were international towns where people came from abroad, and obviously we had Christian merchants coming regularly there and even settling there. And so for that reason, the church began to flourish in those places. But that was not the case in other parts of Sweden where there were no such trading towns, such as Skåne, even though geographically they were closer from Germany. Germany was already Christian at the time. But even though they were closer, international interactions were not frequent there. So there's no traces that Christianity began to penetrate Skåne at the time. But what happened probably around the lifetime of Eric the Victorious, when he was in Denmark, is that the first missionaries began to enter in Skåne. These were missionaries coming from Denmark, from northern Germany, which is rather normal, proximity in terms of geography, but also from England. That's rather significant indeed. Among those missionaries were in fact even bishops from Denmark and from northern Germany, people like Popo, a man named Popo, for example, also Adeldag, a bishop of Bremen, and Odinkar, both the elder and the younger, who were both bishops of Denmark. They penetrated into Skåne and began to spread Christianity in this area. So this is significant because the Battle of Fyrisberg marks really the end, the twilight of Norse paganism. Norse paganism had been the ruling religion, the religion that had shaped the worldview in Sweden up until that time. apart from these Christian exceptions that began to spread, as I said earlier, around Birka and in Gotland, on the island of Gotland in Visby. But now, missionaries began to enter in the mainland Sweden, in particular in Skåne, and began to spread the Christian message. So it's a real turn into the history of Sweden that happens towards the end of the 10th century, towards the end of the first millennium. The end of the pagan society of Sweden was coming, and the beginning of the Christian civilization was about to happen in Sweden. And so the conversion of Eric the Victorious, even though it was short-lived, even though he relapsed into paganism, is a key turning point in the history of the Christianization of Sweden. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.